Good morning. I'm trying to wake you up gently this morning. I know some of you had a big party. And I'm going to tell you some stories with APIs. Now, because we're in England, and I hear that we're quite a health and safety conscious country, I have some few disclaimers. So a bit like when you have a packet of nuts and it tells you, oh, it may contain nuts. This talk is about API. It will contain JSON. Now, if you're on XML-only diet, that's okay. There are some versions of this that are accessible to you in your online store, which is only with XML. But I will be primarily talking about JSON formats and covering a tiny bit of XML. The second health and safety warning is I can assure you that I am digital storytelling free. And by that I mean this is a talk about true narrative. This is about the marketing digital storytelling, which is more about branding and constructing your brand story. This is about what I call true narrative, a plot, characters, conflict resolution. Now, if I'm going to tell you stories, I just had to pick one. And obviously I had to pick one of my favorite ones, which was told by this man. This man is Antoine de Saint-Exupéry. He's a French aviator. So aviator is what they called pilots at the time, where it was really, really dangerous to fly planes. So he had multiple crashes during his career as an aviator, and obviously between the crashes, he also managed to exile himself to America, and he wrote a book that is the most translated book in the French language, which is The Little Prince. Now, The Little Prince is a story of an aviator that crashes in the desert and meets this little man that he calls a little prince. And this little prince tells him this incredible story of what he's been up to and how he's left his home asteroid and come to Earth and all the different people he met on the way. And at the end of the story, the little prince disappears. Now, this story is quite a beautiful example. It contains a different story. It is a children's book, so there are some aspects of it that are quite simplistic, and yet there are some other quite complex things going on, so you'll see. It's going to be an interesting journey. Now, when I'm talking about telling stories with APIs, I'm going to go right back to the definition of what even is narrative structure, which is, this is the order and the manner in which a narrative is presented to a reader, listener, or viewer. So this is me as human. I am able to pick my book up and sort of read the story, and this is what the narrative is. Now, I'm a software engineer, so when I see this, it says, ooh, actually, could I do something fun? And can it be the order and manner in which a narrative is presented to a machine? That could then do interesting things with the way I'm actually reading my story and discovering it. So, I've got the Little Prince. It's literally dead piece of wood, like bunch of paper. And if I'm going to go the sort of classic way that people do books, it's, oh, okay, I have obviously a book resource, my little book, and then inside that there's chapters, and inside that there's pages. So far, so good. So you have actually a lot of sort of books APIs. Think the Kindle API has a format that is a bit like that exposes per chapter, per book, per page. Some of them go even more granular and go into like specific entries in the text. But all in all, this is a relatively simple data model. So you just have one resource that has another nested resource that has another nested resource. So in terms of JSON and things, you can do some smart things with pagination. You can do some smart things with including or not the chapters and the text in your initial requests, and trying to optimize that depending on how you're trying to look at your book, if it's a page per page, if it's a download all this and I want to read on the train. But all in all, this isn't hyper complicated. But if I do this, am I actually solving my problem? And I'm going to go back to something that we say a whole lot to the Government Digital Service, and some of you may have heard about it. Here's a bunch of stickers. There's the identical one on my laptop. And they all say, what is the user need? What is a user need is one of those things that the Government Digital Service uses quite a lot, which is you're about to do some work, you're about to write a new service, a new website, a new application. What is the user need? What are you trying to solve? Or what does the citizen actually need that you're trying to do? Is this, ooh, this could be fun, technical task, let's go do it. No, let's always go back to the user need. Now, The Little Prince is a children's story. So to begin our journey, I'm going to start with a quite simple user need. And I'd like to introduce you me on my 7th birthday. So I think this was about the age that I was sort of given my first copy of The Little Prince, maybe a bit later. But essentially, this is the person that we're going to try to think of in terms of how I'm going to design my API. And I don't know if you know a lot of 7-year-old kids, but they don't do very well with the whole picking up the book and reading it from end to end and remembering all the details and following the structure. They care about two things. They care about the different events, the ones that are going to make them laugh, and they care about the characters. Sort of who is the narrator, who is he meeting, what are they doing? So if I'm trying to do this, and I'm sort of currently sitting on my big API that returns just lists of chapters and pages, and now I've got this new user need, and I want my 7-year-old self, that's slightly odd, to be able to read this book and make something meaningful with it, then I'm going to want to extend my API and start saying, okay, I've got 2 new resources now. I've got events and characters. Now, what's interesting with events and characters is they're not just a list of perfectly chronological things. So characters are in each event, events are in each chapters. Actually, events, some of them will span several chapters. A certain passage in the book will refer to an event that happened previously in the book. So this is not a perfectly linear, I can go from one thing to the next in a perfectly beautiful way. This is actually, if you think about your story, so when he mentions this event, then actually it will link to chapter 7, and this character happens in 5 different places in my book. So you're not looking at list of resources anymore, you're looking at big bunch of linked data. And yeah, this is a talk about linked data. I fooled you all. This isn't actually about the Little Prince. So I'm going to be talking very quickly about 2 different formats in which I could be presenting my events and characters. So JSON API is a standard that is available, and you can see some documentation on jasonapi.org. It is one of my favorite standards. It is still maintained by Steve Klapnick, and I think if Yehuda is somewhere in the room. But it is a very good standard of, I have sort of JSON resources to present, and there might be hypermedia links between them, and how do I even sort of show them? HAL is another option, and HAL will be more friendly for you XML-only dieters, because there is JSON and XML versions of the same type of thinking that you can do with HAL, and essentially it's the same type of logic. You have your resources, and you can do some hypermedia URLs and link all that together. Now, if I have my events and my characters, I'm going to try making a decision about actually which one of those 2 things I want to start and do. Now, HAL has one thing which can be great and maybe not so great in places. So what HAL does is that it embeds child documents recursively. So I've spared you entire slides of JSON, JSON, JSON. So you're going to have to bear with me and try to imagine what that could look like. So when you have, for example, a certain page and it refers to a certain event and a certain character, you would have, for example, if the event has a character linked to it, but that piece of the page also has that character linked to it, you would end up having basically a lot of events repeating the same characters if you're just downloading the entire JSON. Now there's ways around this. You can possibly do some clever paginations, include things, exclude things, but essentially this is how JSON is structured. And the other one on the other side, which is JSON API, has a different way of handling this, and it sort of has a flatter approach to how I look at my graph of objects. So if I'm looking at a given page and I want to know what the events are in this page and what the characters are in this page, it will only mention them once, and I won't have sort of the characters repeated inside each event on my page. So that would be actually quite nice. So going back to 7-year-old me, I am reading my book, and the thing I really care about is, for example, if I'm on a mobile device, I am downloading my story. How on earth do I make sure that I sort of get all the references, I don't need to download everything, and I can do some proper caching? So this is probably what's going to make me make the decision to go with JSON API on this specific use case. Now, because JSON API uses IDs to reference the different resources, so your events and your characters, and doesn't use URLs like HAL does, there is a better potential essentially for caching all the content. So if I have my book content that I've downloaded, browser, mobile, etc., this means that I have a better chance of actually only downloading the information from my character once. And because I know the structure of that book, I also know that basically there's only 2 main characters, and they're going to be everywhere in the book. So if I want to have sort of a good linked data structure, I don't want to have to download the information about little prints 167 times in the process of reading. So if I go with a sort of JSON API approach, I believe that I can actually do some proper events and characters nesting inside my chapters. Now, what is interesting here is that I haven't ruined my existing API. I can still do the whole, I open my Kindle, it's page by page, I click next, 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 and it's all good. But 7-year-old me will still be able to pick up, and if I get confused on a page, just get distracted and look instead at my character or a given event and sort of skip from event to event instead of having to read all the text. And of course, it's a children's book, so there could be actually really cute applications of how you could do that. It's full with pictures, and each event and each chapter has a picture and a drawing, and it's quite poetic. So I encourage you to read it after this, and maybe you'll see a tiny bit more what I mean. Now, as you may see, I'm slightly older now. A few years has passed since my 7th birthday, and when I read The Little Prince, my user need is not, woo, events, characters, yay. My user need is other things. What I want to understand as an adult, repicking The Little Prince and reading that story and trying to make it my own, is I want to understand the context of the story. The context of the story is things like the author, and by that I mean, why would the author write this book, and what has inspired him, and how can his experience and the data about his historical story give me a perspective on what I'm reading, and how can I interpret that, and what is the meaning? Now, Antoine de Saint-Exupéry, he actually made a flight from Paris to Vietnam. I think it was Hanoi. I've got a blank. But quite a long distance if you think about first half of the 20th century. And it all went a bit horribly wrong, and it was him and his co-pilot, and they crashed in the middle of the Egyptian desert. And they crashed with only a week of water left, so that was a bit of a tense situation. They were rescued in the end, and they actually made it out alive. But if you think about the actual story of the book, where you have your narrator that crashes his plane in the middle of a desert, and then meets a little character, this is very much inspired by basically this entire week that he spent in the desert hallucinating because of the lack of water, and thinking about death and probably quite morbid thoughts by that time. And this is what one of the things that inspired him to write the book. Now, as a reader, if I'm reading this, I would like to know, when I open the chapter that says, I have crashed in the desert, chapter 2, I would like to know, please take me to the story and how this relates in real life, and why this hallucination that he had in the desert has inspired him for this. Now, I am not going to bother writing all that data myself, because people have done it for me. So DBpedia is a linked data API version of Wikipedia, which means that I could be able to access essentially all the information about the author, all the information about his life, potentially information about the Sahara Desert, and any other things that I might find relatively useful in the context of the book. Now, if I look at this data, what is interesting about it is that it is so consistent in the way that it exposes the entities in DBpedia. So you've got, for example, authors, and they're clearly named as a person, and you have events, and they all have sort of types of events, and they have all predetermined schemas and ways of populating that data. Now, schema.org, I encourage you to go check it out later, or maybe now if you're all on your laptops. It has an extensive list of lots of different entities that you can represent in JSON, XML, whatever you want, but it essentially lists a sort of suggested list of attributes of what an entity like an event could be, or what an entity like a person could be. Now, why this is interesting is that it means that I can use sort of DBpedia with a schema I am absolutely confident that I know what it's going to look like, and I can also use other data sources that also use schema.org. And this isn't just sort of me thinking, oh, this is a cool website that has schemas. It's used by real companies. So Google are backing it, and sort of Wikipedia is using it. And so the obvious example of why that actually impacts your experience online is if you Google, let's say, Antoine de Saint-Exupéry, and you will have your Wikipedia sort of widget entry on the right. That will be powered by that type of schema.org based metadata on your Wikipedia page. So schema.org, nice. If I'm going to be using DBpedia, they are suggesting whole ton of ways of getting that data out. Now, I've already chosen a JSON API, and at that point, I want to sort of introduce more linked data and link to other services from my book. And the obvious choice for this is JSON LD. Now, why? JSON LD, can I have a show of hands of who's even heard of JSON LD? Okay, all right. So JSON LD is a W3C sort of recommended protocol. No, not a protocol. So JSON LD is a format, and it's an extension essentially on the JSON notation, and it stands for JSON linked data. So if you have your resource that looks like a big blob of JSON, what you can do is it adds extra little things like an ID and a context, and it has different ways of making sure that you can link your resource to another. And it does so by using schemas like schema.org, and they have there's a very close link between using those two. And it means I can end up with a format of JSON that is supported across a number of different APIs. And the beauty of this is, instead of doing the whole, yay, semantic web, you used to have a RESTful API, chuck it, do it again. No, you just keep your RESTful API just the way it was. You can keep your CRUD thing. You can just add some data, and it won't break your existing API. So this is why I'm interested. I am interested in adding extra contextual data without breaking my user experience who just wanted to read the book page by page and doesn't give a crap about that metadata. Now, JSON LD, I really encourage you to go check it out, but you will see probably right now in your email, you will have examples of it getting used. So Google are a very good example. So if you have a Gmail account and you check your email in that, and let's say you're a developer and you use GitHub, if you get a pull request opened and that you need to review it or an issue, look at the sort of title of the email and look on the right. There's this like little button that says view pull request or view issue. So this is based on JSON LD and schemas, because there is a predetermined way of saying, you, user, part of your story is you can go and take that action, and there is a determined way in which that is said in this JSON LD format, and Gmail interprets that and sort of shows it as your next action thing. So this is a tiny little story that you can tell yourself in your browsers when you're checking your email. Now, this is very practical and in terms of brand engagement or sort of where you want to go, but it's so much better when you're thinking about APIs, because it's not just, ooh, I can go do the next action, but it's, here's this raft of metadata that is all tagged in a way that is meaningful. And if you don't actually care about the people, but you care more about the locations, there is a predetermined schema that can allow you to filter that upfront. So yay, JSON LD. Let's assume that I've implemented all that and I've managed to deploy all this. And now I'm sitting with a JSON API that has a number of books. Each of these books have chapters. Each of these chapters have pages. On each of the pages, I can look at my characters and my events, and I have enhanced that data in a way that is great for me as an adult, because I can go and check some historical references and understand more about the meaning of the book and why it meant so much to the author by seeing the links between the data in the book and some data, for example, on Wikipedia, but possibly other sources. So what does my user need now? So I can read it and I can feel really smart because I can tell my friends at dinner, it's like, did you know that Antoine de Saint-Exupéry, la-di-da. That's probably not exactly everything I want to get out of this book. Now, I'm going to give you a quite difficult user need, and as you may know if you've read the book, The Little Prince is maybe a children's book, but it has some very profound learnings and implications and metaphors about the meaning of life and love and how you should live and die. So definitely not a children's book in that respect. And when I read The Little Prince nowadays, what I'm looking for is a deeper understanding of life. Now imagine you're a software engineer and sort of your product owner walks in and be like, hi, we're going to make an API and we wanted to give you a deeper understanding of life. And I'm like, what? I don't know how to do this. I'm going to take an example of one of the things in the book that could actually give me a better understanding of life. And we're going to try deconstructing that and see how we can do that in API. Now, there is a quite famous passage and sort of several events in the book that built this metaphor called The Rose and the Little Prince, and I'm going to tell you a tiny bit about that. So this little prince comes from an asteroid that only has one rose on it and 3 volcanoes. And his little rose is everything that he loves, and he cherishes her and protects her, and he has put her under a glass dome to protect her from the evils of the world. But basically, he's kind of getting a tiny bit fed up with his Rose, and she's very demanding, and she's asking him to take care of her all the time. So what the little prince does is he leaves his asteroid, and he goes on this incredible journey that makes him meet 6 different people. And it eventually leads him down to Earth, where he meets our narrator. And when he is on Earth, he does wander around a bit, and he meets a fox, and he meets a snake. But one of the things that he sees is a garden full of roses. Now, he comes from a planet where there's only one rose, and he didn't even know it was a rose, and he's never seen any other flowers before. And then he is confronted in this garden to suddenly thousands and thousands of roses, and he realizes that this rose that was everything to him on his planet is actually quite meaningless and not very unique. And he is devastated and incredibly sad. And as he progresses through his journey and talks a bit more with one of the other characters, which is the fox, he slowly realizes that maybe his rose isn't unique. Maybe now he knows that it is a rose. But there is this beautiful quote that says, "It is the time that you have wasted for your rose that makes your rose so important." So essentially, he gets this understanding that even though he was disappointed that he doesn't have the only rose in the universe, his rose and all the attention that he has given her over the years makes her incredibly more important than the thousands and millions of other roses that he could find on Earth. It's not quite a children's book, eh? Right, so I'm a software engineer, and I'm going to tell you what not to do now. So what not to do. This is from real-life mistakes that I have made building APIs. So this is I'm a Ruby engineer, by the way, and it sort of taints the way I have screwed up my APIs in so many hilarious ways. So as a Ruby engineer, I go into Rails and I create sort of an active record model that maps directly to my database, and then I let Rails auto-generate a bunch of JSON for me. And nothing can possibly go wrong, because if I have modeled this in my database that way, surely the JSON will look right. So that's one thing that I've messed up so consistently over the years. It's hilarious in a really sad, messed up way. And the other thing that I have to try to do is, I'm a software engineer. I know everything about this business model. This story clearly explains what those entities are and what those relationships are. And I don't need to understand the broader context of those things. I just know that this thing has many this things. So for an example, the book has many chapters. That's a pretty straightforward one. Not too much confusion there. But actually, if you're looking at more complex relationships, just saying "meh" has many of that thing can backfire quite significantly. So I tried not to do the same mistake all over again, and I tried looking, don't worry, you're not supposed to read this. This is just a context from a page. So what I did is, all right, so how do people even do this? How do people model their interpretations of stories and events in narratives? And this is a shameless plug for a dear friend of mine who works for the BBC as an information architect, and who has developed over the last few years what they call the Story Ontology. Now, a tiny bit about what they mean by ontology. It's essentially a semantic definition of, you take an entity and you're trying to determine what are the different entities that are part of that thing. So this is supposed to be an ontology that describes what a narrative could be. Now, there's a few things that are actually relevant to what we're doing today, and this is the part of the ontology that we actually care about. So it literally says thing in the ontology, just because they've struggled so much in sort of trying to shoehorn every possible narrative in a way of expressing it as entities, that it just ended up with thing. So this ontology is currently used by the BBC to run what they call their mythology engine, and you need to think about TV shows and things like that. So they have really cool representations in those entities of Doctor Who and other shows like that. So I'm going for The Little Prince, and they went for Doctor Who, which has so many more characters. Time travel. I didn't go for Doctor Who. I thought I'd spare you the headache. So we have essentially 3 things that we care about. We have our story, and we seem to already have that modeled in some kind of way in our API. So we have events, and we can sort of consider that an event, sort of a global event in the book, is actually a tiny piece of the story, and it works well with The Little Prince. But we also have things. So let's say the thing is this quote that I gave you about his realization that his rose is actually pretty amazing, and we would have an interpretation of that. Now, if I'm reading this book, if I am going to extrapolate some extra meaning from this, I actually want to know what interpretations other people are having of this moment. And it would be interesting, for example, to know what the author meant here, but it would also potentially be interesting to know what other people are thinking when they are confronted with that quote and with that realization that the Little Prince has during the book. Now, the rose for the author is a metaphor for his, let's say, tumultuous relationship with his wife, and he essentially calls, there is an entire book written after this by his wife about how she is his rose and they have this tumultuous relationship, and how basically his different travels, he was traveling all the time, but he always ended up thinking that even though there were many sort of other women that he would meet in his travels, she was essentially the one that he had spent so much time on, that she was the one he cherished most. And there's other interpretations of what that romance could be. Now, if I go back to sort of that little graph of things, I have essentially different links that are slightly more complicated to model than what I was doing before. We're no longer in the has-many world. So reading interpretations is going to be hard. I'm going to take it to the next level and say I even want to write interpretations. I even want to say, well, when I read the story of the rose, to me it's not about sort of romantic relationships, it's about the longing for home and sort of cherishing the nostalgic notion of home, for example, and how you sort of travel and you see other roses, but essentially you're always attached to your homeland. And all those things could add context to the book and be read by other users and suddenly have this shared understanding of what this narrative is and enhance the understanding of the book and, you know, human race and save humanity and all that. But more seriously, it also means that I am confronted with a JSON API and suddenly I have to add operations. And by that I mean I can not only just read interpretations, but I can also post interpretations and submit them. Now, JSON LD doesn't support sort of self-describable operations, but you can add something extra on that called Hydra, and we can go into a tiny bit more of that later. But what I actually care about here is I've got all my JSON LD, and I don't want to sort of pick up the book and then have to read a crazy API documentation about what I can do with it. What I want to do is, if I'm on page 5 and suddenly there's this quote, it is linked to this actionable thing that says, you can go read the other interpretations of people, let's say they're just a bunch of text, let's make it easy, but I can also submit my own interpretation and sort of tell you what this passage has made me feel and realize. And if you're building on top of JSON LD, this means that you can add an operations tag and make it self-discoverable. Like literally, you're going through your narrative, and if your reader is equipped to sort of look at those operations and discover what it can be, you can describe, okay, you can post on this endpoint, and this is the type of action, and you can give it a description, and you can sort of tell it in advance what type of attributes and things you would expect, so if you want to text and things like that. And it also means that you can sort of tag those different actions in different places. So you may want to have only sort of read for some users. You may want to hide that away entirely if you're addressing children who don't possibly want to sort of hear the tortured thoughts of adults reading this book and realizing that their life is meaningless. And you basically just have this extra self-describable tag in your API, and you haven't broken anything, and you're just saying, and now extra thing happening in my JSON, I can add an interpretation. Now, I've basically ended up talking about The Little Prince a little bit, but essentially I've talked a lot about different API formats. And we've gone through sort of the JSON API format that I sort of mentioned was really quite nice to have sort of flattened APIs. I've quickly mentioned how, which has also its advantages. I've went to JSON LD and used schema.org to be able to map data to other data sources in a meaningful, documented, and W3C supported way. And then I have added on top of that Hydra to be able to have some self-discoverable endpoints in my API, so I can post and contribute to the narrative and create another narrative on top of my narrative, which is, you know, this is how I feel when I read the book and what it makes me think about. Now, why on earth am I telling you all this? This isn't talk about The Little Prince. I would really enjoy if you go read it afterwards, and I'm sure you'll really enjoy it. But this is about what are we actually trying to do with APIs? Now, I could have just walked up there and been like, oh, this is JSON LD. These are the 3 screenshots of like the specification and things. But I just assumed that I'm talking to a bunch of very smart people, and there is some great documentation out there, but it's more about, so what are these formats and why should I use them and why are they interesting to me? And I've solved it through, I'm going to tell you a story, but actually we're all trying to do the same thing. So whether you're trying to sort of book a hotel room somewhere, or if you're trying to sort of get some government data about your local flood, essentially you're going through the same problem. It's at some point, your data model is going to get so complicated that you can no longer have the simplistic approach of, yay, it's a book, it has chapters, it has pages, go. Suddenly you're sort of confronted with linked data and meaning and those extra semantic ontologies that are so much harder to do. So we are all telling stories online in some kind of way. We're all telling stories because we're all telling our users different sort of pieces of information. And if we're trying to go sort of hypermedia URLs and have sort of more self-discoverable APIs and really guide our users through their journeys and sort of address what their real need is, there is no user in the world that will tell you, what I need is a get endpoint that gives me a collection of 5 things, and then I can go to this other get endpoint and get that collection of 2 things. No way. And if they do that, it means that they are actually doing quite a lot of the work on their side, and you're not sparing them the pain. So when you're confronted with your real-world API, what happens in real life is you kind of start figuring out what your users are trying to do with your data. And even there are some edge cases that you're probably not going to want to address, but you have a good idea of what the sort of main business value or use cases of your users are. Now, the real question is, do you want to address that by throwing a heap of documentation at them and supporting them very well, which can work? Or are you going to, at some point, get confronted with the fact that your data model, like this story ontology, is just getting complex enough that either you're going to make it painful, or you're going to make it disorganized, or you're going to just give up on the idea of even presenting that data. And finally, don't give up on letting people choose their own path. So when the end API that I end up with my little prince is, I could just read the book and not be bothered with all this extra stuff that I've added. But if I add an extra filter on my API and says, I'm a child now, give me extra cool stuff about the characters, or I'm an adult that is willing to contribute sort of my thoughts and feelings about this book, I would start looking at those other tags in my JSON and start self-discovering endpoints and activities that I can do. And when I read a book, this isn't about, I go from page 1 to page 100. This is, I put it down, and then sort of life happens, and I have all these realizations. And this is about making that experience possible through an API. There is a little story in The Little Prince. When the first time the narrative meets the Little Prince, the first thing the Little Prince says is, please draw me a sheep. Slightly odd. So the narrator is just a bit surprised because he's just been stranded in the desert and there's this little prince that came out of nowhere. But he humors him and he sort of starts drawing a sheep. So this is the first sheep the narrator draws, and the little prince doesn't like it, and it looks a bit ill. And the second sheep that the author draws looks a bit like this, and the little prince is like, what, that's not a sheep. It has horns. Like, what were you thinking there? So the narrator starts again and draws a third sheep. And the little prince is still not very happy with this sheep. Too old, doesn't like it, not what he wanted. Remind you of something? Have you ever had a conversation with a client that is like, that's not what I wanted. This is not the specific data model and resources in the shape in which I wanted it. That's true. Now, the narrator has a really cool hack, and he finally manages to make the little prince happy. And he makes the little prince happy by drawing a box. He draws a box, and he says, there's a sheep in it. And the little prince says, yes, that's exactly what I wanted. So if I take this metaphor like way too far, if you think about how you're shaping your APIs and things, we're all trying to make our own little flavors of sheep, and we're all trying to sort of make them cute, and we think that actually the horns are probably like the best feature of our API. That is possibly entirely true, but I would encourage you, this is a sort of slightly call to arms, and I'd really like this to happen over the next few years, wrap them in a box. And by that I mean use formats that other people are using. Let's follow sort of the W3C recommendations, and let's look at those formats that are starting to emerge in linked data, and let's not recreate the wheel every time that we can. And more importantly, this means wrapping it, quite literally. So give me clients and give me documentation, and don't just give me a sheep. I don't know what to do with a sheep. If you give me a box that says there's a really cool sheep inside, and by the way, this is the instruction manuals for a sheep, and you can buy some grass right there to feed your sheep. Thank you. There's a few picture acknowledgements about sheep and roses and various pictures I've used during this presentation. A special mention for the BBC Stories Ontology that I've used, and there is a whole dissertation, and Paul Risson, the information architect that has worked on that, recently made some great presentations, and I invite you to look at that if you're more interested in what even is data architecture for stories. Thank you.